Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Boon or Bane, What Will Data Centers Do to the Grid? Thanks, everyone, for joining and hearing this discussion on a very important topic. My name is Jeff St. John, and I'm Chief Reporter and Policy Specialist at Canary Media. We're a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering the climate crisis and reporting on the energy transition and on solutions to the problems that bedevil us. And we're here today to talk about data centers, their growing demand for electricity, and what utilities, regulators, advocates, and the data center companies themselves and developers themselves can do to manage this growth. It's becoming increasingly clear that we can't build the power plants and power grids fast enough to meet the growing demand for power from AI and data centers, at least not on the high side of the forecasts of the power demand. And trying to build up the grid based on these highest forecasts is dangerous. It could drive up consumer energy costs, and it could undermine progress on cutting carbon emissions fast enough to fight climate change. But these are not foregone conclusions, and I am very glad to have here today three experts who can talk about what utilities and data center developers and companies can do and are doing to create alternative futures that are sustainable. First, we have Brian Janis. Brian is co-founder of Cloverleaf Infrastructure, a developer of clean-powered, ready-to-build sites for the largest electric loads, and well experienced in the data center field as former vice president of energy at Microsoft. Thanks, Brian. Next, we have Michelle Blaze. Michelle is senior vice president of global grid modernization at AECOM, which is a global engineering and construction firm working with utilities and data center developers. Thanks, Michelle. And last but not least, Jeremy Fisher is principal advisor for climate and energy at the Sierra Club's environmental law program and co-author of the Sierra Club September report, Demanding Better. Fascinating report. Thanks very much, Jeremy, for taking the time to join us today. And we are going to have a wide-ranging conversation, and we are eager to bring our audience into that conversation as well. You can submit questions via the Q&A function. You can also upvote the questions that you like, that you've put in or that other people have put in, and we will be moving along to those questions in the latter half of this webinar. So please do use the Q&A function early and often. But let's go ahead and set the stage. And let me start by asking you, Brian, what have you learned from your decade plus in the data center and energy space? What's going on in the market today? What's it like trying to get a multi-gigawatt clean power data center up and running today? And can you tell us about Cloverleaf's approach and maybe a bit about this project that Cloverleaf is putting together in Wisconsin?
Sure, happy to discuss all those things. And probably the biggest thing I've learned is that planning for data centers, especially like how much capacity, what to build, is really hard. I remember being in a meeting, this was probably 2013, with Steve Ballmer, and he turned to our VP and said, so how do you decide how many data centers to build every year? And our VP started to respond. He said, well, I talked to the business groups, and Steve said, stop. He goes, they have no idea what the demand for their services is going to be in the next 5 years. The best thing you're ever going to do is just get an Excel spreadsheet and draw a straight line from the past. It's the best forecast you're ever going to make. And Steve actually turned out to be right. It was extraordinarily hard, quarter in, quarter out, to forecast how much capacity we should build. And I think the AI moment introduces even a greater degree of uncertainty than the cloud moment did, for a couple of reasons. One, that the cloud transition was in large part a lift and shift of on-prem workloads into a cloud environment, whereas AI is creating entirely new means of consuming data, of creating data. I was hearing Satya on a podcast last week talk about this, and he said, the part of the challenge with AI is that it's not just humans putting in requests for, say, a search in a search engine, right? There could be a million AI agents out there doing that. So it's almost like AI is creating demand for itself, because you're creating these agents that can go out and proactively drive demand for more compute and more storage. So that's one challenge. And obviously the absolute magnitude of the tranche sizes that we're having to go out and get, right? When we started growing Microsoft's cloud in 2010 timeframe, we had 150, 200 megawatts, deployed globally. So even at a fast growth rate, the step-ups were small. Now the step-ups are huge because you're talking about already doing it on a gigawatt scale base. And so that's where Cloverleaf comes in. I mean, our focus is really how do we solve the critical challenge of expanding the grid to support these loads, because we think the grid is the key to solving this. And how do we innovate around technology, regulations, and policies to ensure that this load growth can be achieved, and all the associated benefits of economic development, jobs, et cetera.
Okay, so difficult conditions in which to kind of expand, and it sounds like quite a bit of uncertainty. I wanted to turn to you, Jeremy, to talk about some of the uncertainty and what we ought do in the face of such uncertainty. So you co-wrote this report in September titled Demanding Better. Two meanings there, right? The challenge of demand growth and what we, as I suppose, participants in this energy ecosystem ought demand from the utilities, the regulators, and the data center developers to make sure that this growth happens with climate and cost imperatives in mind. What are the principal ideas that you lay out there for a better way to manage fast growing demand? Where do we see utilities and data center developers taking action on these principles, and where are they falling short?
Oh, wrong button. Sorry about that. Thanks, Jeff. And this is such a timely and important discussion. I think we really think of 2025 as, amongst everything else that's happening in the energy sector, data centers are going to really have a very clarifying role. For those of you who aren't familiar with why Sierra Club's even in this conversation, we're our nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization, 64 chapters, 600,000 members across all of the states in the US. But we also host one of the more comprehensive decarbonization projects been going on for the last 20 years, trying to move gas and coal offline across the US. And we've been doing that in state houses and public utility commissions before federal regulators. But the whole construct of data centers as an impact really came up on our radar in 2023 in Virginia, where we got an integrated resource plan from the utility that said, hang tight, we're going to have to back off on our transitions from coal and gas to clean energy because we've really got to deal with this load growth issue for a bunch of new data centers that are coming online. And that was shortly followed by after, and Jeff and others have written about this, by spaces where you saw this in Georgia with multiple gigawatts of new demand, I think 9 gigawatts demand for new data center, new gas plants in the Carolinas, and we've seen this in Nebraska, Wisconsin, Nevada, just across the U.S. Large swaths of space where there's a huge demand for new gas plants that are coming online and a pushback of coal plants that were otherwise coming offline. And at the same time, we are having discussions with data center providers in other parts of the country who are talking about their rigorous climate commitments, but at the same time having backroom deals with utility operators who were ultimately leaving their coal plants online and letting those utilities advance those gas plants. And so we really wanted to come out front and say, we really actually need to have a conversation about this. The Demanding Better paper really tries to lay out, here's the issue that we're running into, right? This differential between the climate commitments that are coming forward on these corporates and the utilities requirements that they're putting forward. And we're asking that the technology companies really try to be, there's sort of three basic things that we're asking for in Demanding Better. First, we're asking the technology companies in this to really be allies to both ratepayers and climate progress. And that means that technology companies really need to be able to step forward with their own demands for clean energy and do so in a publicly regulated proceedings where the decisions are actually being made. Second, we need the technology companies to start paying for the clean energy that they say they want and the grid services that are required to make sure that they're not contributing to emissions increases. And that really means paying for the services like storage and transmission and demand response. And third, we really want the utilities and the technology companies and the regulators to really start putting themselves together in a space where we can put together tariffs and structures that make sure that we're keeping existing customers whole. Today's data centers are really fundamentally unique. As Brian just pointed out a moment ago, the difference between bringing on 150 megawatts total for your entire system versus the gigawatt scale proposals that we're now seeing roll out more or less every month is just substantially bigger. And that's creating cost and risk for other consumers. We need to be able to mitigate that. As others have pointed out, the pace of data center growth is just unimaginably fast, almost too fast to track. We're seeing 23 states that are on their way to having a gigawatt or more by 2030, and credible proposals for more than 100 gigawatts by 2030. And that's just staggering. And the good news is that we are starting to see some changes. We're seeing the first clean transition tariff that was put forward in Nevada that allows utility and the customer to really align on what clean energy they're looking to obtain for their requirements and to try to match their incentive along with that clean energy. But at the same time, we're not nearly moving fast enough. In 2024, we saw close to 50 terawatt hours of new data center come online. And that's almost as much as all of the new solar and wind that came online in 2024 as well. So we're just not keeping up. And at the same time, we've seen gas plants grow by more than 50%, proposed gas plants grow by more than 50% in 2024 alone. So there's just a ton and a half of work to be able to do. So looking forward to this conversation and happy to answer those questions as we start getting into it.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeremy. A lot of principles to follow there. And Michelle, I wonder if you can help us understand the past, present, and perhaps future of the kind of utility enterprise and the large customer kind of imperatives here. AECOM does big and complicated infrastructure like these gigascale data centers we're talking about, and you also have a ton of experience on the utility infrastructure side, in your former role leading engineering, project management, and smart grid and technology at Commonwealth Edison. It seems that traditional concepts we have of a utility just serving one-way power to a passive, static, large load customer is really changing, and really, one might argue, needs to change. It seems the future involves a far more collaborative, mutually dependent, but also mutually reinforcing and beneficial relationship between these two parties, the big loads and the utilities that supply their power, or that bring power that these large loads have gone out and procured for themselves to them. Can you help us understand how the traditional relationship between utilities and large customers has worked and has led to the situation we're in right now, and maybe a little bit on how moving toward a more collaborative kind of space can help us to begin to solve these problems that we're in right now?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think you're going to hear the word collaboration quite a bit today. But ultimately, right, traditionally, utilities plan for load growth. They plan to have customers come in and add new load. Generally, that's based on past trends of load growth in areas in their service territory, and known as well as unknown future growth. Data centers are a different type of load. The data center owners, developers, they need it much quicker. They're coming in with a gigawatt of load, 200 megawatts of load. That's not what the utility traditionally plans for, and need it right now because the market forces are asking for this growth. So there's sort of the dynamics. It's a timing issue. It's a cost issue. It's how quickly can you get this in when get this new large customer that you didn't plan for in service. Ultimately, I think that the solution is collaboration. There are opportunities to work better together, I think, to kind of solve this issue. We're seeing that in places. From a short-term, looking at those solutions from a short-term and long-term perspective. Short-term, that could be opportunities to maybe phase in the project. All it comes down to is more communication, better understanding of where each other's challenges are. We're seeing that happen successfully in some places. And think about a longer term solution. Are there collaborative innovations where we can partner together longer term? I think right now we're in us trying to solve the issue today based on what we knew in the past. And it's going to need all parties really to think, how do we do this differently?
Well, we're definitely going to get into some of those collaborative solution sets later on in this conversation. I can see the questions are already coming in asking about them, but let me see if I might start from a more foundational place and ask you guys for help in understanding it, which is one of the more, I would imagine, confusing, frustrating aspects of this whole data center and AI boom is just how uncertain so much of it is. We've got just nationwide growth forecasts for, demand for AI compute that are kind of all over the map, built on business assumptions that may or may not be connected to real world energy and development constraints. And then you got to ask the question, who cares about nationwide forecasts when utilities need to know what they need to build and when? And then you get into these tricky areas where you have, prospective data centers being shopped to different jurisdictions and double, triple, quadruple, quintuple counting. You've got, development opportunities driving a lot of, people trying to get a piece of powered land into the interconnection queue and things like that. And just this enormous amount of uncertainty. I might start with you, Michelle, and then turn to Jeremy and then Brian to see if you can help us understand what the situation is there, why it is difficult to get an accurate sense of what's going on, particularly at the individual kind of utility or state regulator level, and what strategies or policies or we might want to put into play to try to get a grip on what's going on.
So one of the things that you miss in terms of it's not just a load growth, the where is important to the utility. The where is key. There's also other water and fiber is important to the data center. The ability to maybe work together for the utility to perhaps say, hey, this is where it might be least cost for you on our system. Providing that sort of transparency between the parties, I think is something that we're seeing may need more of. I think I go back to the issue of location is really important. There may be areas in the utility service territory where it might be cheaper, easier to bring that transmission line extension out to the service and quicker as well. It's talking together, communicating, and having that transparency, I think, is important, and we need more of that as well.
Yeah. Actually, if you don't mind, Jeremy, I might turn to Brian real quick. Brian, in what circumstances is collaborative work possible right now versus what I might imagine to be a highly competitive set of circumstances in which different data center developers are essentially trying to get in front of each other to get the spot they want. I don't know where and how it might be possible for utilities and data center developers with real bona fides to come in and say, we want to do this, and here are the preparatory steps and commitments we're able to make in advance to see this thing through to a more mutually beneficial conclusion.
Yeah, I think there is room for collaboration, in part because I think all data center operators are recognizing that the scale that they're operating today, it is going to break the system if you don't pursue some of the things that Jeremy and Michelle were referencing around protecting other ratepayers, making sure that we have the adequate sort of cost recovery done in a ring-fenced sort of manner. And in fact, you had mentioned previously, Jeff, our project in Wisconsin, we're actually working on a tariff side by side with Microsoft, who also has a very large facility in that region. And so we are working, with the commission and with the utility to pursue a new tariff that allows for that sort of ring fencing that ensures that 100% of the costs that will go to the data centers, or that will be required to support these large data centers, will be recovered from the data center customers themselves. And so I think there are opportunities for collaboration. Of course, it's still very competitive, right? And everyone wants to get ahead and everyone wants to have an angle, but at the same time, we have to recognize that if this industry is going to thrive, it's going to thrive because we find points of collaboration, especially when it comes to regulations and policy.
Yeah. And Jeremy, let me turn to you. I think these kinds of collaborations are part of the policy prescription that you and your co-authors laid out in Demanding Better. I also know that Sierra Club has had thoughts in particular about the Microsoft proposal in Wisconsin, some concerns about gas build there, and that there may well be some kind of rules of thumb that environmental and consumer advocates would keep in mind and bring to regulators and policymakers' attention when they want to make sure that these concepts are being borne through to kind of their best ultimate kind of end result. What can you tell us about like what needs to happen for these things to work out in ways that work for everybody?
Yeah, sure. And I think Brian is starting to touch on it here of looking for these mechanisms of being able to really cut down on the speculation and increase transparency, right? Sort of top of mind for us is really being able to have a much more public conversation about what it is that we're actually driving towards, who's going to pay for it, and what it means for our larger public interest. Where for many of these, utility requirements, they've often come in as negotiated deals between the utility and a data center, which is, it's important to have that collaboration. It's also important to have enough transparency for the public, for regulators to understand what's actually going on, that they can assess what of this is speculative, what of this is actually reasonable to be able to grow for. I think we're really starting to challenge the construct of an obligation to serve on what kind of time frame. But if you're really looking for a rule of thumb, I think the easiest one that we're really going with at this point is rates before infrastructure. We need to have structures in place to ensure that, not only are the data centers that are coming online held accountable for the costs that are going to be incurred into the rest of the system to hold other ratepayers harmless, but we also need to make sure that they have enough skin in the game, that they are actually coming in with a commitment that is real, right? We don't want to be in a space where if in fact something doesn't transpire a couple of years from now, we have ratepayers who are now held with the substantial costs of being able to build on behalf of a customer that ultimately didn't come through. And I think that that's a important just principle across the board. Some of the disconnects that we have seen that we're hoping to try to get past is, Brian mentioned Wisconsin, interesting example there where we have sort of two separable spaces of a tariff that's being developed in a rate case styled proceeding. And separately, you have a utility that's also pursuing new infrastructure in order to serve large load customers that's separable in a different type of proceeding. And that's the kind of space where it makes sense to have those layered onto each other in a way that's much more integrated so that you have a singular discussion. Here's what we're planning for. Here's what we need to be able to do. Here's how we want to be able to do it. Here's who's going to pay for it. And then ideally, be able to have a much better discussion about maybe we also just don't need to serve this with new gas. Maybe there are better ways of doing this too.
I would imagine that I wouldn't envy the utilities or the regulators or the large load developers in this circumstance necessarily. This is highly complicated. I think utilities have an obligation to serve that doesn't permit them to kind of blithely designate certain types of customers as subject to special treatment or pay before you play and stuff like that. But I guess Michelle and or Brian, I don't know if you have any thoughts about some of the policies we've seen emerge in recent months, really, say from the AEP utilities in Ohio and Indiana, Michigan Power, where we have kind of large load tariffs, and where you see the right line being drawn between managing those very real concerns that Jeremy brought up, well, doing what utilities are supposed to do or are legally obligated to do, not overstepping. I'm not sure where the lines are drawn, but I'm curious if there are kind of rules of thumb from the utility and the developer side as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that real quick and then turn over to Michelle. But yeah, I mean, you're right. The utilities have an obligation to serve. They also, particularly in this environment, serve an incredibly important economic development job creation function for their local communities. And so a lot of utilities are seeing this as a probably the economic development opportunity of a lifetime for their states and cities and communities. And they should see it that way. There's a tremendous amount of jobs that get created, not just from data centers, which include the construction of those data centers, but also the operations. And they're not, the data centers, I think it's a mischaracterization to say data centers don't create a lot of jobs. They do create a lot of jobs, less than auto factory does, but they still create a lot of very high paying jobs in these communities. And then if you add on, the IRA and CHIPS spending related to manufacturing, I mean, these are huge opportunities for utilities to make intelligent investments in their system, drive that economic growth. But it also has to be done in a way that is environmentally responsible. And I think, Jeremy's right to point that out, that, the solution can't be, well, now we're just going to build a bunch of gas plants. And so we have to find ways both to, one, sort of ring fence those costs from the rest of the ratepayers, but two, continue to put pressure on the customers as well. And kudos to Jeremy and his peers. They've done a great job over the last, let me say, just being a thorn in my side sometimes, and with my old job in putting that sort of pressure, such that, particularly the tech companies have really led in that area and need to continue to do so. And yes, it is harder today to achieve, those environmental targets that they've all set because of that growth pressure, but it's not impossible. There's a lot of things that we can do with the existing system to get more efficiency out of it, to leverage grid enhancing technologies, to think about the role of deploying more storage. I think I saw someone in the comments mention that Duke study, right? And a lot of what we're trying to solve for is peak capacity issues. It's not that we need tons of new baseload resources. We need some, but the challenge we're trying to solve is really, in the near term at least, about flexibility of the existing grid. And so there's a lot we can do, in concert with utilities and technology providers to come up with solutions that achieve both the goals of growth and sustainability targets as well.
I would add that I think this is right. It's a huge issue. We're sort of addressing it as a crisis, but we need to really be focused on long term, and it's something we're going to need to chip away, try different ways of solving it, but I think there is not going to be one size fits all answer, but being innovative around different approaches, different ways to solve, different partnerships that need to be brought in for a solution for a particular location. So I think it is partnership, innovation, and know that it's not going to be solved overnight, and you're going to have to kind of experiment, try different approaches. And think about this as a long-term solution.
I don't know if it would be presumptuous of me to ask you all if you could sketch out some solutions in the making out there in the world from your own experience or those you're tracking. I know I want to focus first on the point you made, Brian, that so often the kind of grid congestion, the inability to serve these large loads within the timescales they want to get built, is not so much the fact that you can't get enough energy to run them most of the time, is that you can't get enough energy to them during the particular hours of the year when the system at large can't handle that extra load on top of its peak, right? It's winter mornings, or it's summer afternoons and evenings, or the substation serving this load is going to be overloaded at those peak hours. And that does seem to be a really important place for lowering that peak to come into play. And I think that there are some examples. Brian, you mentioned one that you worked on with Microsoft back up in, I think, Cheyenne, Wyoming a while back, which might not be ideal from the Sierra Club's perspective, Jeremy, as it did leverage, I think, natural gas. But I think it also came with a commitment to buy a bunch of wind. And then there are also other options like that. But I don't know how utilities, Michelle, would look at the option of having a data center that can keep its peak within boundaries and kind of build that into what resources it needs to build next. So things get really complicated. Sorry, that was let's have a free for all, guys. Whoever wants to.
I would say this is there. There's been a lot of quite a bit of discussion and testing out of potential solutions, things like load flexibility. Is that something we can think about? Is it to address the peak, some of the peak shaving, not all, issues? There's new cooling technology that's being looked at. Overall, an organization like AECOM, when you think, we are, right, we look at the intersection, it's water, fiber, as well as power. How do we bring all these together for a solution for all? Are there ways to drive more energy efficiency? What are the new technologies, whether it's backup generation, UPS systems, to help minimize the load or the power demand, and then as well as addressing some sustainability issues. So it is very much it's not two parties in this discussion. It's important to think about all that are impacted, and then how do you bring them all together to optimize?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that there's potentially some low-hanging fruit here, right? And part one of this is being careful about where we're actually siting our data centers, and recognizing that there are a variety of issues that are going into those decisions of where to site, including our, not only energy issues, but our latency and access to fiber issues. But when we start putting ourselves in a position where we're citing numerous gigawatts worth of new demand with utilities that don't have a particularly good track record on being able to actually move themselves away from fossil power, or don't have commitments in that direction, then we are effectively lining ourselves up to be putting ourselves in greater exposure to gas prices, greater exposure to fuel prices, and it increases the exposure for all customers, not just the data center customer alone, right? I think right now we're in a bit of a capacity crunch and crisis, right? Where we're seeing utilities offer gas peakers as the mechanism of being able to get it. I don't think it's very long until we start to get to the space where we're actually in an energy crunch. And so I think if we're looking forward a little bit further, then maybe one of the sets of solutions that we should be looking a little more closely at is to those data centers that don't need the extraordinarily fast latency, starting to think about where those can get sited in the US that allows them to tap into clean energy portfolios that include solar and wind and geothermal and all of these other mechanisms that really meet the vast majority of their hours. And if you start taking into some of the some of the mechanisms that Brian's been talking about for being able to use grid enhancing technologies and on-site storage, then you can really get to this space where you actually can have data centers that have a de minimis impact on other ratepayers, a potentially positive impact on the grid, if at least minimizing their negative impact on the grid, and are functioning off of clean energy in a way that they've actually committed to. But it does take working together to try to figure out where those spaces are going to be, and potentially slowing that pace down sort of across the board and not encouraging the race to the bottom.
Yeah, and I think you can. I mean, the way we sort of look at the world is, we want to find locations on the grid where we can, one, find good load pockets that already have excess energy available most of the time, and then go solve that capacity problem. And then as we're solving that capacity problem, do it in a way that prioritizes grid enhancing technologies, virtual power plants, batteries, and if necessary, some low capacity factor peaking natural gas. And that may just be gas generators behind the meter that we're going to go behind the meter of the data center anyway. And Jeff, you referenced our Cheyenne, Wyoming project at Microsoft that we did years ago. And that was all predicated on a utility saying, hey, we're going to have to build a gas peaker to support your continued load growth. And we said, well, wait a minute, like, why can't we just put that gas peaker in lieu of our diesel generators? So now we're not building two power plants, for every megawatt we bring onto the system, but rather just one. And the idea being that, sure, in those periods of system constraint, I can use those backups that I was going to put there anyway to be that. But hopefully over time, not need those at all. And they just become backup, and they're actually not serving any function anymore in terms of actually providing energy, onto the grid. And I think, there are ways we can do that. I'm not so much of a purist to say that we're not going to have to build new gas to support this load growth. I believe we are, but it should be largely peaking resources that are going to be very low capacity factor, really only needed to provide reliability and system stability in extreme scenarios. As much as possible, we should be looking at ways of avoiding having to build lots of new combined cycle plants, because I don't think that's the right way to go solve this problem. I don't think it's the most efficient way. I don't think it's the least cost way. And it's certainly not the most sustainable way to do that.
Mm-hmm. I do want to make sure to start turning to questions, and I'm going to pick this one because I think it pertains to what we're talking about. This is in less than a year or two since the GPT boom. We already have more efficient models like DeepSeek, and advancements will only continue. Do you think the projected energy demand is being overstated? Or perhaps we can take it a step further and say, given the uncertainty regarding the amount of energy we're going to need, how do we plan a collaborative solution that takes the uncertainty into account? For example, by building assets that can be depreciated and replaced in 10 years rather than 30, or by avoiding what might be seen as unnecessary capacity for delivering peak loads when a demand side solution could obviate that and give you room to grow into your energy demands as they occur. But Michelle, you had a thought on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's what we've all been kind of talking about in a way. It's the collaboration. If there's one thing we are certain about is the uncertainty of how much this is what's really going to happen in terms of the growth and the power demand of these data centers. The innovation that's happening, whether is a part of the solution that will help us better understand that growth. And it's gonna take folks who are now on opposite sides working together to get there. And you're right, there has been projections of data center load doubling over the next 4 or 5 years at doubling the rate. That's interesting, but we don't know that for certain. So how do you plan for uncertainty? And it is by taking long-term approach and having contingencies and working in a collaborative manner about what if this happens, then what? What's our 5-year plan together, rather than let's get this load in. Well, let's get this load in next year, whatever you have to do. I'm only thinking about what I need today. That's the change I think that's going to really be very impactful for all of us.
Yes, Brian.
I was just going to say on the question about demand, are we overestimating, underestimating? I think there's probably been an over-indexing towards focusing on training and very large training models. And I think we probably are overestimating, how many multi-gigawatt models we'll need. But at the same time, I think we may be underestimating inferencing. So I think that the overall demand signal that we're seeing, I think, is very real. There's a question of how much of that is going to be training versus inferencing. But I'm personally quite bullish on the underlying energy demand for AI.
All right. I have a lot of questions here about the essentially responsibility of data center developers, or those companies that are building and using electricity to do what data centers do, to bring clean energy online. We've got one that mentions Illinois working on major legislation that would require data centers to bring their own clean energy resources with them, so to speak. There's some other questions regarding how one might seek to require data centers to bring solar, wind, or other resources to offset energy use from a city or county permitting perspective. I wanted to bring up the clean energy issue because it's pretty important. And I think it ties into the question about what do we do with uncertainty as well. There's been a lot of discussion, it seems, about people building gas plants to power their data centers, and largely doing it independently of the existing kind of utility regulatory paradigm. On the other hand, I know that John Ketchum, the CEO of NextEra, said in the same breath as NextEra announcing that it was moving into the gas power plant business, that the backlogs for getting the turbines and building those power plants is about 4 or 5 years. seems like if you're looking to move quickly, you want to move with the resources that are ready to be deployed quickly, which might be hard to interconnect, which might be hard to permit, but perhaps no more so than gas. I just want to figure out and ask you all if bringing the clean is not only the right thing to do from a climate perspective, but whether or not it aligns with what the right thing to do is from a cost and speed or time to power perspective as well, or where we see differences in different regions or different regulatory constructs.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that concept that, I don't think the solution is every data center needs to have its own power plant. In fact, I think that's sort of nonsense. I think it fails to appreciate the value that the grid itself actually provides and the diversity of resources. And I have this debate a lot inside of this industry. And one of the things I have to remind people of is there's no such thing as an off-grid data center. You're just connecting to a different grid, which has its own constraints and has its own regulatory limitations. And there's no panacea here, right? And I agree with you, Jeff. I think the fastest thing to do is figure out how do we leverage the stuff we've already built more efficiently. How do we find things that can enhance that? And that's where we get into things like grid enhancing technologies, get more out of that system. I mean, the electric system in the United States is very underutilized in a lot of respects. And so there's a lot more we can do with the existing system than just say, well, every new data center needs its own new power plant. Like, I don't believe that's true. I think, in fact, our project in Wisconsin is proving that out. We'll have a lot more details about that over the coming months coming out. But, it is served from a diversity of resources on the grid. There is no single thing that's supplying that load. And this is a multi-gigawatt load as well. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot more we can do. The challenge is, I think it's hard, right? It's hard to understand the intricacies of the grid and how you work through all those things and how do you create the right sort of rates and incentives. But it's not rocket science, right? I think people kind of go to the simple thing, which is, well, we'll just build a gas plant next door. But it turns out in the long run, that's probably going to be more complex, slower, and, as you said, Jeff, more costly.
Thought maybe I could respond to that because I agree that we definitely should not be building new gas plants adjacent to and co-locating with data centers. I think that that's a recipe for long-term exposure to fuel volatility and potentially other massive impacts on the remainder of the system, even if at the beginning of the case they're otherwise disconnected. But maybe Brian, in response, I think one of the concerns that we've got with just utilizing the existing system that we have today is that the marginal increase of electricity requirement for the system that we have today is almost entirely gas and coal, right? And so as we've started to integrate a lot more clean energy onto our system, one of the things that's been really successful in doing is driving down the utilization of existing coal, for example, and reducing emissions, great health benefits, incredible climate benefits, and really shifting towards a productive mechanism of helping utilities understand how to bring clean energy onto their system in a meaningful sort of way. If we're in a space where we're just relying on the existing energy that's on the system today, we're broadly increasing the amount of that fossil energy that's already in place to the detriment of the communities who have benefited from those emissions actually going down over time. So what we need to also do is, in conjunction with utilizing, the deeply underutilized infrastructure of our electricity system, transmission lines that are only utilized a fraction of the time that they otherwise could get used, is building a bunch of renewable energy in the places where it can get built in an effective way to be able to get it online quickly, utilizing the rest of the system that is currently overbuilt relative to where it needs to be. And I don't think we're necessarily speaking different words there, but just important to make sure that we're on track to be able to actually meet that new energy requirement with new clean energy.
No, that's a great point.
Yeah, you had asked earlier about solutions, and I think I mentioned an important thing for utility perspective is location of where that load is. I think it sort of aligns with what both Brian and Jeremy are saying about there are parts of the system that are not underutilized and could be opportunities to locate large loads at lower cost than maybe other preferred locations. And I think it goes back to how do we work together? How do we provide more transparency to a Microsoft, to an AWS about where those places are, and how do we get that discussion going as at least a starting point.
Excellent. And I know there are a lot of questions in here about why don't you essentially build the data centers where the clean power can be most easily built? And maybe a flip side question is, why would you build a data center in places where electricity is more expensive? I don't know if we should do a quick discussion of what kind of data centers are got to be in different places depending on what kind of data center stuff they do. Real quick, Brian.
Sure. I mean, high level, going back to the comment about training versus inferencing. I mean, a training data center can be very remote. It doesn't have to be. It's not serving sort of mission critical load. It's not latency sensitive. But as more of the workloads migrate to inferencing, this starts to look like traditional cloud data centers, which means they do need to be closer to population centers. You do still have labor issues around, I mean, it is hard to build in very remote places as well, because they do require, especially if you start talking about gigawatt scale data centers, you're talking about thousands of construction jobs. So being close to population centers is important. And that does sort of make it challenging to say, well, let's just go build everything out in West Texas where there's a bunch of wind. It's not really feasible to do that. So yeah, we still are going to see data centers built in the way they have been in the past, close to people and eyeballs and GDP. Like that is an imperative for the business. But we also have to find a way to enhance our transmission system so we can bring more of that clean energy to the places where people are, right? And so we can achieve, I think, both of those goals. But I don't think it's feasible to say that all these data centers can be sited in places that are just close to where the energy already is.
And Jeremy, I wanted to bring up real quick. You mentioned an important point, which is basically growing electricity demand unmatched with increasing amounts of zero carbon generation to meet it leads to a greater utilization of the marginal generation, which is mainly fossil fueled. I guess one could argue that the same thing could be said about growing demand from electric vehicles and or electrified building heat. I guess the counter argument to that would be, well, those things reduce emissions from the things that they're replacing with electricity. I always think I struggle with the idea of cost and climate causation and where the boundaries lie between data centers or hyperscalers making their own climate commitments and then either adhering to them or not, depending on what you make of their latest new data center development plan and the tariff they've structured. It could also be a question about state policies, since states are the place where most of this regulatory and policy activity takes place, it seems, and the extent to which states can impose climate requirements on large new loads, and how far that can go before it kind of runs afoul of the idea of this being a utility that serves all customers and that you can just go across the border to the state that doesn't have those climate commitments. I'm sorry, I didn't ask a question at the end of that. I'm just wondering how you navigate all those challenges and where you draw the line.
Yeah, I think the most straightforward frame, there's a natural question of why is there something fundamentally different between the load growth that we're seeing for data centers and the other load growth that we expect from industrial electrification, building electrification, commercial electrification, right? All of these various pieces that we do expect to see increasing demand on the electric system over time. Right. And just to put that in perspective, right, the amount of electrical demand that we're seeing increase from data centers, even though it's substantial nationwide, is a small fraction, modest fraction of the overall load growth that we expect to see if we're going to a fully electrified economy, right? Full stop. But what has two impacts. It's first, highly geographically concentrated, right? The amount of concentration that we see in Virginia is just mind-blowing. It's extraordinary, right? And it's really hard to deal with in very specific geographies where it's occurring. And second of all, it's happening really fast, right? And so questions that we all thought were 2035 questions about how are we going to meet requirements out in 2035 and gear ourselves up to be in a position where we can make sure that permitting and interconnection and all of these pieces are in play in order to be able to get there are now 2026 questions or even 2025 questions. Right. And so we no longer have that luxury of the time to be able to build the policy framework to be able to ensure that that can be met in a clean, sustainable way. It's happening now. Second main instance that's happening is that these customers are unique in that they're just huge components of any given utility's load onto themselves, right? So you have a customer that comes in with a gigawatt scale proposal for a 4 gigawatt utility, right? And that singular customer is carrying a quarter, well, now a fifth of the utility's peak demands requirements. It's sort of imperative that you treat it as a singular instance rather than the more organic growth that we get from the larger basis. So I think there are opportunities to be able to make it work, but I think it does need to be staged differently and a little bit more uniquely than we've thought about other elements of load growth.
Yeah. I want to ask a question that got a lot of upvotes, which I think kind of gets at what you're talking about. This is from Amory Levins. Hi, Amory. If a data center developer guarantees to pay for the power, even if the project fails to get built, wouldn't the developer also risk bankruptcy, leaving other customers stuck with unneeded supply investments? Should the promise therefore be bonded? Michelle, I don't think this is the first time utilities have dealt with very big customers coming in and figuring out what to do about whether or not they stick around. I think we have things like departing load charges where large customers pay for the infrastructure costs that they would otherwise abandon if they don't stick around as long. We have interruptible loads. That doesn't sound as pleasant for the load as a flexible interconnection load or something like that, but these are possibilities. But what are the kind of reasonable bounds within kind of the legal and regulatory framework in which utilities deal with large loads to put the responsibility on cost or on carbon, if we want to talk about that, on the large loads versus the utilities as regulated monopoly providers of energy to all comers? You know, how do we figure out what the just right solution is?
You're asking me a question that there's no answer to right now, right? There are all sorts of different solutions. As Jeremy said, that the type of load that data centers are bringing in are not typical. There are tariffs, examples of tariffs that I'm aware of. For example, is a large load comes in, and I don't know that it doesn't matter whether it's a data center or 10 megawatt plant. You pay for the infrastructure, and you sort of get some of it back as you build through the load that you're committed to. So there's somewhat opportunities. I've seen tariffs where there's sort of the risk, it's a shared risk in terms of the cost. Those seem to work in certain areas. But then again, you're dealing with a different type of load than I think what's been traditional. I don't have the answer. It goes back to continuing to try different innovative tariffs. Currently, there's the FERC decision to PJM to figure out the co-location issue in tariffs. Will be interesting to see how that turns out. But it is going to be different. It's not. I don't have the answer that applies to everyone. I don't think anyone on this call does.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say to that, at least, I mean, the presumption that the DC developer would be faced with bankruptcy or something like this. I mean, we got to remember that the amount of money these companies make turning electrons into data is one of the greatest businesses that's ever been created. Like it was what I call the watt bit spread. The spread between the cost of a watt and the value of a bit is enormous. And so the actual cost of electrical infrastructure as a total TCO of a data center is actually relatively small. And so it's a lower risk proposition than I think, well, even some of the data center operators would admit, for the utility to go out and secure capacity and infrastructure on their behalf. in comparison to the return potential of the utilization of that. And so I actually think it's relatively low risk to ring fence these costs for these customers. As you said, Jeff, I mean, you have departing load charges and other things to say, hey, you are going to bear 100% of this cost. You know, to the extent that some of it can be repurposed, great, we'll credit you back. If you buy a bunch of 345 kV transformers, there's a lot of demand for that, fine, we'll repurpose those. But I think a properly structured ring fence tariff, one, can minimize, or if not even completely eliminate, the risk to the existing ratepayers, provide a tremendous amount of upside for the utilities shareholders to encourage load growth. And I think it's relatively low risk for data center operators as well, because it's just a relatively small percentage of the overall cost of their doing business.
I concur. I guess I might ask what the watt-bit spread is for the unproven AI business proposition as opposed to the existing enterprise and cloud compute proposition. But
I mean, if you look at Microsoft's latest earnings, I mean, their AI business is doing incredibly well. And it's not just in the services, right? It's in all the things. I mean, if you look at the value of an NVIDIA, GPU, in terms of the economic return it is to that company relative to the cost of the electricity going into it, it's very small, right? I mean, the value, that entire value chain, from the folks that build and operate data centers, from the folks that operate services inside those data centers, the ChatGPTs of the world, all the way through, the chip supply chain. There is so much economic value in that stack that's why I say the spread between that cost of that electron that goes into that stack and then all the economic development that is created on the back end of that is just enormous.
Yeah, right. I wouldn't disagree with, is this a huge financial risk for the owner, but the cost for that infrastructure can be pretty significant. Building a 20-mile transmission line and substation is not a small undertaking, and it becomes it's timing, permits, supply issues. All are some of the construct issues, as well as the cost. In my experience, I've not seen a data center owner say to me, "Oh, is that it? Okay."
Yeah, no, they won't ever say that. I agree, but I think I disagree that there's. I think they're going to say that all the time. They're always going to complain about cost, but when you actually put it in the full context of the entire ecosystem, I mean, if a 1 gigawatt data center costs, I mean, from a CapEx standpoint, is about $25 billion. And that's just the capital that goes into it. And then you start thinking about the margins that are earned on the services offered. I mean, the ecosystem is so big. Yeah. Sure. But you're right, Michelle. I'm sure the people buying your stuff are like, squeezing you for every penny. But there's a lot of money to be made in this system.
I'll bring you into meetings with me going forward. Right?
Please don't.
So maybe I can just go ahead and answer that question straight up and say, yes, there probably ought to be some element of collateral or bonding, or at least some element of financial assurance that's going back to the utility to the extent that we're putting these in, right? Because whether it's a small amount of the ultimate, supply chain that's coming into the data center, or whether it's a really large, substantial investment, for the utilities that are handling this and the ratepayers that are otherwise handling stranded costs, if it fails to transpire, it's enormous. Right. And so from their perspective, that's a risk that absolutely has to be mitigated. So, yeah, I have no doubt that a Google, a Microsoft, a Meta, right, have plenty of money to be able to backstop their commitments in this case. I don't know as much for some of the new entry systems that are coming online that are hoping to be co-hosts and sell space to some of those hyperscalers and other entities. And so I think there probably does need to be some element of a ring fence tariff and a structure to ensure that ratepayers are made whole in the case that something goes awry.
All right. I know we're almost out of time, y'all. And I promised I'd give y'all 5 minutes to, in turn, give a parting thought. I think we just have 2 minutes left. But let me ask you guys what your parting thought would be to our audience, particularly if you've got one that pertains to the cost issues we've talked about, but also the climate issues that we've talked about here. But don't let me prejudge what you want to say.
Would you like me? I can start. I think I've been sort of probably redundant in continuing to focus on the importance of collaboration, the importance of planning together, the importance of thinking about this as a long-term partnership, and also ensuring that you're including all the key stakeholders in this process. It's the water, it's the fiber, it's the local government, it's the economic development organizations that are around. I think that need to be thought about to bring together to kind of come up with short-term and long-term solutions as well. They're very complex issues, from sustainability, climate issues, as well as costs to the customers, costs to the owners, costs to the community that are involved, as well as there's a market driver here to get this thing to happen quickly. I think we're going to need to be thinking about innovative solutions, not be stuck to what we've done and how we've solved this in the past. And that innovation is going to be driven by bringing different thoughts and ideas together, and chipping away at it bit by bit.
All right.
That's my final repeated message.
Thank you. Well, Michelle, your final thoughts may have to stand in for all our
sorry.
Because no, I think that they're very appropriate and very comprehensive. So, Brian, Jeremy, if you don't mind, I will let Michelle's final thoughts stand in for a summarization of everything that we had to work on ahead. Thank you again, Brian Janis, Michelle Blaze, Jeremy Fisher. Thanks again to all y'all for joining this conversation. And please, thank you for supporting Canary Media and our nonprofit news mission. We always welcome your support. Look forward to seeing you again on the next one of these we put together.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jeff.
Thank you.